Also, you may disagree with me on this, but I actually think that libertarians have had a real problem actually getting to grips with how this could have occurred because their theory of political economy is different from everyone else's.
Yeah, let's see.
Like for example, I mean, what do you think happened in order to have Trump be where he is, from a libertarian perspective?
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
I guess you guys would say that it's like the same thing as usual, which is that basically cronies did cronyist things, and then democracy caused it to happen.
Let's see. Libertarians sort of just have that. You ever? There's a famous quote by H.L. Melkin. Let's see. Pretty describes the libertarian view on this matter. Let me bring this up.
Hmm.
Also, this quote is kind of really witty. It's kind of funny, honestly.
Okay, go on.
Okay. As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represent more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last. The White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron.
Downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron. That is great, actually.
Yeah, just
I
on
mean,
a
he really
libertarian.
has. He really has actually come to embody all of their neuroses.
Let's see. I don't know. With libertarians, or more so the libertarians at the Mises Institute, people like Lou Rockwell and Rothbard, they probably have a really mixed reaction when it comes to Trump because, well, for one, they advocated for right wing populism during the 1990s, and just it's just a really confused reaction because they like Trump because they be subverting the media and just subverting a lot of things that libertarians despise in this status world that we're living in, but at the same time, they just sort of just view him as a crony, a New York liberal. Just it's really confused, honestly.
Hmm. And so
Yeah,
I would say that you have to. It's almost like you would have to go right back to the beginning and like get an entire theory of just how the world works to then understand how all of these things could happen. So, I mean, one thing that I often get from libertarians is kind of like, not you, but obviously other libertarians I've talked to before. It's kind of like these plaintive questions of like, oh, why don't the rulers behave in the way that we think they should? Why do they have to do these things? Right? Is everyone stupid? Are people in power all retarded? This kind of thing, right? But it's because government looks like it's omnipotent from afar, but it's not the way that it seems. When you take government and use it to act, the government also acts upon you, right? As
just
soon as you actually take office, the forces which begin to act on you are different from the ones before you began to take office, right? And then the role of government is not to actually take actions itself, but to get others to act on its behalf using economic incentives. Or it's kind of like saying the king needs an army and someone has to run it.
let's see. Let's see. I think from a more Hoppian perspective, it's always about just incentives, just for giving the right incentives to the right kind of people and
Yeah.
giving democracy incentivizes short term with a boundary and
Yeah. But I mean,
just
do you accept though that the Hoppian position leads ultimately to a dictatorship because the number of people who are your key supporters are culled down to a very small number? Because in,
dictatorship.
in, in Hoppian conception, you don't have the entirety of civil society that you're beholden to at that point. You're beholden only to the people who you selected.
That sounds not sure about that, but it just seemed
Yeah,
like
because if he's saying that there's going to be no democracy, then you'll have a very small number of keys to power, right? A dozen generals, bureaucrats, and perhaps regional leaders.
then that's an oligarchy then, like something like
Yeah,
Russia.
yeah. You end up with a sort of privatized oligarchy, right? And then of course you end up with the problem you have with governments immediately, which is if you displease them, they will replace you.
Well, with Hoppe, he wants decentralized political units. Well, more accurately, in his terminology, community covenants, social orders. You know,
Hmm.
it's basically that it is a community. You have to agree with the set of rules. It could be a libertarian. It's more accurately a conservative social order because he's more of a libertarian conservative in that sense.
Mm.
So that's why you get the memes like physical removal. It means like if you're a bum, unproductive, dishonest society, the people in the neighborhood will shun you, eventually kick you out from their social order or whatever. This honestly, this kind of just happens all the time. You just don't really think about it that much.
Well, what if you condensed it and looked at it from the other way around, right? Which is to look at it from the perspective of almost like if you looked at it from the perspective of corporate power, for example, that you should make sure that your economic activity is generated and distributed to you for all of your hard work and for the key supporters need to keep your position. And so if you think about it from the perspective of governance, it's all about figuring out how best to raise and distribute resources so as not to topple the house of cards on which your hegemony is based. So if you're Hopper, for example, and you're, I guess, an aspiring benevolent dictator, right? Benevolent dictator, and you're trying to help your citizens, quote unquote, your influence over the way that social order runs attracts rivals, and so you have to keep the people who support you loyal. But there's only so much GDP you have and only so much distribution you can do. So every bit of treasure that you spend on citizens is treasure not spent on shoring up people's loyalty. And so you see the problem here. This will develop ultimately into an oligarchy because you're going to eventually have to pay people not to revolt against you.
So it's just gonna look like Mobug patchworks.
Or Vladimir Putin's state. And this is the thing where I'm pessimistic on this.
Wait, it could look like the since Hopper's German, it could look like those competing princely states when Germany was decentralized. You ever thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a very similar things, but that's also a very old social order, isn't it?
Mm.
I mean, that's not very modern at all. Something older than they might like to admit. The other thing that causes the expansion of power as well is that we talk about these key supporters, but being a key to that person's power is also itself a position of power. So they too have to watch out for rivals from below or above. And so the resources which they have must also be spent in a way that maintains their position, which means that then cronies have other cronies.
I see what.
And so you see how this works. You end up with a web of power that is being created. How is it described in Russia? Because you described it just earlier, where they said that the democracy quote unquote failed, and they ended up having to reconstruct something else instead. I mean, what you described is called the vertical of power, right? Where you end up with cronies supporting other cronies who also have cronies, who also in turn have cronies.
That's pretty smart what you do there. You're flipping all the criticism back on hobbies. That's pretty smart. That's really smart. Just like what you just said remind me of a quote. Basically, in one of the passages in Democracy, the guy that failed, he said, "Once entry barrier to government is allowed, and when the way humanity is what it is, always coveting other people's properties, democracy essentially just leads up to more parasitism." Basically, he said in the end that no one is ultimately safe under a democracy.
Well, I'm going to make the argument that actually you are safer in that scenario than you would be in Hopper's ideal society, because of the fact that the narrow range of people in this vertical of power system means that everyone else becomes dispensable. Because think about it, if you're not in on the the loyalty factor, then how are you important to them in any way? This is why they're able to cut social services to the bone and things like this as well. Because when you have only a narrow section of supporters and no actual democracy, you can cut just about anything because of the fact that you're not obligated to those people in order to keep your power position anymore. So you end up with a more, I guess you could call it, quote, efficient government, but it's not necessarily one that produces the best outcome for most of the people.
Yes.
Because there's no incentive. There's no incentive. Like, if you don't have an incentive to get into office to please at least, I guess, a wide swathe of the population, if you only have to please 4 people in order to hold your position, then you can imagine what that country might look like.
Look like Eastern Europe and Russia.
Yeah, basically. So you end up with that problem. And it's surprising that no one who's read Hopper or any of the others surrounding him, such as Walter Block and others like this, have actually pointed out this problem.
Actually, someone else did point that problem. Yeah.
Who was it?
The guy who was on my channel 2 weeks ago.
Oh dear. Well, I hadn't listened to that person, so I hope that we haven't literally overlapped each other on every point.
Let's see, he's doing he basically pointed out that Rothbard libertarianism will look like the gallows of Eastern Europe.
Yeah, he got it exactly. He got it almost exactly where I was going to go then.
Yeah, so yeah. So the
And
thing
then
is,
in contrast, you have the representative democracy model, right? And so you have power being divided among many people. It's taken allegedly not by force, quote unquote, even though it really is, but with words, meaning that you get thousands or millions of citizens to like you on election day, then you can get into power. Except obviously, I'm sure we've both heard this quote before. It's one about how democracy is how to have a civil war without actually killing anyone.
isn't America kind of like that? Because it's very clientelistic, similar to Russia. It's still kind of, well, it's corrupt. It's just we're just wealthy, so just sort of just high.
I
Maybe,
no, I think the United States was always more pluralistic than Russia was. It's only recently in 2016, probably before that. But I think it's only recently it's started an accelerated convergence where it's starting to look more and more like actually Russia.
but it just seemed like, given if you look back in the 19th century, you have people like Mark Twain just complaining how really corrupt Washington was. And it seemed like things haven't changed that much, but things just become more transparent. Just United States was one of the first states that invented clientelism. Just not one of the first states. It's just you just don't notice it because we got a bunch of resources.
Another thing I'd say as well is that it's all a matter of compared to what, because the United States is still better. I mean, or at least it was until recently. I should say, let's take a neutral year. Let's say it's the year 1999. The United States in the year 1999 was still one of the best places to live on planet Earth, right? I mean, we agree on that.
Yeah,
yeah. And so, relatively speaking, there could have been worse. And this is another point which I want to get in on libertarians here as well, where they talk about where they claim that democracy leads to higher taxes. Is this something that you guys agree? That you guys believe, all of you uniformly?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay, why do you all believe this?
We all believe this because democracy is inherently centralizing. It's a very centralizing force. And it requires, due to trying to subsidize the lower middle classes, the unproductive classes, the so-called parasites, it will eventually lead to more wealth redistribution, more inflation. So more inflation, basically devaluing the productive members of society.
Okay. So yeah, I get where you're going with this. I feel like
it's it's kind of Darwinian.
Yeah, I kind of feel like your view on this, you don't intend to do things which are bad to people in this case. It's just that there's a fact which I believe sincerely, like this is not like a talking point or something. There's a fact where I sincerely believe that you're overlooking here. And so I'm just going to explain to you, then you tell me what you think of it after I get to the end, right? And so if you're sitting comfortably in democracy, which I guess you are, right? And people are getting tax rebates and there are people who don't pay income tax and so on, right? So that is in fact bringing the average tax rate down. The idea that people are getting tax rebates and there are 47% of people that don't pay any federal income taxes in your country and stuff like this, right? Now you're thinking, well, what about in a semi-feudal conservative dictatorship, for example? Is the tax even lower than it is in the US presently? I would say no. And the reason for this is because there's a difference between actual taxation versus taxation that we wrote down on paper and presented to you. Now, I'll explain what I mean by this. Dictatorships, or at least semi-feudal dictatorships specifically, often forego tax paperwork in favor of just taking the wealth from people directly. For example, it's common for a semi-feudal state to force farmers to sell their produce to the state for little and then turn around and sell that produce on the open market, pocketing the difference at a massively high equivalent tax rate. Now, technically, that's not recorded as a tax, but it is a tax, right?
Sound like rent sinking, to be honest.
Indeed. Now imagine, because many libertarians will look at me and say, well, you invoked the state here. Maybe we just don't have the state do it. Okay, so what happens if you're in a semi-feudal state in which everything has been privatized into the hands of landlords who operate in the free market? And then the landlord extracts from the peasant the equivalent of a 90% tax by simply taking the produce off of them and then selling it at a higher price and pocketing the difference.
So,
You see what I mean there? And so you end up with a, quote, free market, small state, semi-feudal system in which your actual real effective tax rate can be something higher than 90% because of the fact that landlords have done it instead. So they've simply privatized the task of collecting your taxation and called it rent. And you're thinking, and some of you might be thinking, well, where has this ever happened? Nepal. This happened in Nepal up to about 2006, where they were taking 90% of people's wealth away in rent each time until people finally rose up and overthrew it. But what were they overthrowing? They were not really overthrowing a gigantic state in the sense that people usually understand it. It was a very distributed form of oppression because it was distributed in the form of landlords backed by the state, which was a small government state.